Jazz, like, scream or say something. I looked that way, and all I saw was, like, blood all over the floor. She's not gonna come back. Oh, my mommy. Oh, my mama.
4:30 p.m., just another day for a police officer patrolling the streets in his car. Suddenly, a breathless 16-year-old girl named Tasmay Whitehead ran up to the vehicle. She was in a panic, screaming and trying to explain something to the officer. From her choppy words, the cop understood that the girl and her sister had returned home from school to find their mother murdered. This is Detective Brooks. You're on the DBS channel. Today, I'm going to share with you one of the bloodiest and most shocking cases on my channel, so be sure to watch until the end. That's where it gets really interesting. Although I didn't personally investigate this case, my colleagues from the investigations department shared the details with me, and I decided to tell it all to you. This story took place in the small town of Conyers, Georgia. The officer immediately called for backup and medical assistance at the scene of the tragedy. Arriving at the address Tasmay provided, the police saw another girl near the house, an exact copy of Tasmay. As it turned out, they were twin sisters, Tasmia and Jasmia. The girls were in a state of shock from what they had seen. They were immediately given first aid, trying to calm and stabilize them. Meanwhile, a group of police officers entered the house to examine the crime scene. Right from the doorstep, their attention was drawn to a long bloody trail stretching from the door to the street. Judging by everything, the victim had tried to escape from the attacker, but he caught up with her and dragged her back into the house to finish his bloody deed. What the cops saw inside shocked even seasoned officers. On the floor, walls, and even the ceiling were brown bloodstains, evidence of a brutal massacre. It seemed as if someone had deliberately splattered blood all over the house. In my years of service, I've seen many crime scenes, but this picture was one of the most terrifying. The officers carefully examined the house room by room, searching for the victim's body and any evidence that could shed light on the identity of the killer. Eventually, in one of the rooms, they found what they were looking for: the mutilated body of 33-year-old Nikki Whitehead, the mother of the twin girls. I can't help but note the diligence with which the killer tried to cover up the traces of his crime. The entire house was literally flooded with blood, but it was clear that someone had tried to clean up, albeit unsuccessfully. To completely cleanse the crime scene in such a short time was practically impossible. Later, Officer Chrisman, one of the first to arrive on the call, admitted that in his entire career, he had never seen such a bloody scene. This place made a depressing impression even on hardened cops. During the house search, the body of 33-year-old Nikki Whitehead, the mother of the twin girls, was found in one of the rooms. She was lying in the bathtub in a pool of her own blood. The woman had become a victim of a brutal attack. Her body was literally riddled with numerous stab wounds. Especially horrifying was the fact that the victim's spinal cord was practically severed. It seemed as if the killer had struck this area with particular fury. The expert who arrived at the crime scene counted about 80 stab wounds on the deceased's body. It's hard to even imagine the agony the poor woman endured before her death. It was also strange that the towels from the bathroom had disappeared somewhere. Later, they were found in the washing machine, soaked in blood. It looks like the killer tried to get rid of these pieces of evidence, but in a hurry just shoved them into the machine. On the same day, a criminal case was opened under the murder article, and an active search for the perpetrator began. The first to come under the scrutiny of the investigation were the victim's daughters Tasmia and Jasmia. During interrogation, the girls said that the house where they lived belonged to a man named Robert Head, with whom their mother had a relationship. But as it turned out, Robert was not Nikki's only admirer. The girls recalled overhearing their mother repeatedly talking on the phone with some Nikki Joe, especially when Head wasn't around. This fact interested the investigators and required further verification. Was Robert Head involved in the murder? What role did the mysterious Nikki Joe play? And most importantly, who actually committed this terrible act? Now I'm going to tell you all about this in detail, but only for those wonderful and amazing people who subscribe to the channel right now, like this video, and leave any comment on it. Help me spread this story so people can draw conclusions from this shocking case. So, during the interrogation of the victim Nikki Whitehead's daughters, new details of her personal life were revealed. Tasmia and Jasmia said that they had repeatedly heard their mother talking on the phone with some Nikki Joe, especially when her cohabitant Robert Head was not around. Interestingly, the girls themselves never saw Joe, including on the day of the tragedy. But the most intriguing fact was that on the eve of the murder, Nikki spoke again with this mysterious man, and then a serious quarrel broke out between them, after which the woman angrily slammed down the receiver. This detail immediately caught my attention as a detective. After all, it is quite possible that during that conversation, Nikki told her admirer about her desire to end their relationship, and such a decision could well become a motive for murder. How many times in my practice have I encountered similar situations? A rejected lover commits a crime out of jealousy or resentment. Therefore, this version definitely needed to be checked. The police quickly found Nicky Joe and invited him for questioning. The man was genuinely surprised to learn the reason for the summons. He categorically denied his involvement in the murder and claimed that despite the one-sidedness of his feelings and the fact that Nicky kept him at a distance, he sincerely loved this woman and would never harm her. Joe confirmed that on the eve of the tragedy, he and Nicky really had a quarrel, but assured that it was a minor dispute over a misunderstanding, which was quickly settled. Moreover, according to him, for the entire day of January 13, he had an ironclad alibi that completely ruled out the possibility of committing this terrible crime. Well, Nicky Joe's interrogation left more questions than answers. If it wasn't him, then who was it? Another version began to form in my head. What if the murder was committed by Robert Head, the man Nicky Whitehead was living with at the time of the tragedy? Perhaps he found out about her secret communication with another man and decided to brutally take revenge on his unfaithful cohabitant. However, the version about Robert Head's involvement in the murder was quickly dropped. During the investigation, it was established that the man worked as a long-distance trucker and on the day of the tragedy was on a business trip in another state. So purely physically, he could not have been present at the crime scene and committed this terrible act. And so the cops found themselves at a dead end again. On the one hand, there was the mutilated body of a victim who died a terrible death. On the other hand, there was a complete absence of suspects or leads that could put us on the trail of the killer. As an experienced detective, I understood that in such cases you need to act methodically and not miss a single detail. The first thing law enforcement did was thoroughly search the crime scene and collect all possible evidence from blood traces to fingerprints and microfibers. All these samples were sent to the laboratory for examination. While they were waiting for the analysis results, it was decided to delve deeper into the personal life of Nicky Whitehead. It was necessary to find out who the deceased communicated with, what places she visited, what she was passionate about. The detectives were especially interested in the last weeks and days before the murder. Perhaps that's where the key to this horrifying story was hidden. And then Nicky's daughters Jasmia and Tasmia came to mind. After all, who could know more about a woman's life than her own children? The girls were the closest people to their mother and could remember some details or events that would help track down the criminal. The police decided to take the sisters to the station and carefully question them there in a calm environment. Of course, the girls had just experienced a terrible tragedy and were in a state of shock. On the way to the station, one of the patrolmen noticed Tasmia's strange behavior. She kept biting her hands hard until they bled. Her sister Jasmia explained that for Tasmia, this is a usual way to cope with nervous tension, especially in stressful situations. Like now, after such a shock, this is a completely normal reaction. During the interrogation, the detective began to have a vague, alarming feeling. At first, he attributed it to professional intuition, which often helped in investigations, but over time this feeling only intensified. First, the detective found it extremely suspicious that Tasmia and Jasmia seemed to be crying, but at the same time there was no trace of tears on their faces. It seemed as if they were squeezing out this cry.
He's not gonna come back. Mommy.
Playing to the audience, which was quite strange given the circumstances. Secondly, the detective could not help but notice how the girls spoke about their deceased mother. In their words, there were harsh, even offensive epithets about Nicky. You know, usually children who have just lost their parents remember them with special tenderness and even some idealization. But here everything was different. It seemed as if the girls were talking about some stranger or even a person they hated. And this led to certain thoughts. The longer the interrogation lasted, the more the detective became convinced that the sisters were hiding something. Whether out of fear or for some other reasons, but their testimonies constantly had some kind of understatement and contradictions. And this made us think, what if they themselves were somehow involved in this horrific story? In the end, the team of investigators decided to separate the girls and interrogate each one individually. Of course, they began to resist, begging not to separate them, but the investigators were adamant. Although it's not very pleasant to separate sisters who have just experienced such a tragedy, the interests of the investigation required this step. By the way, another interesting nuance: Tasmia and Jasmia did not take off their gloves the whole time, even inside the police station. At first glance, it's a trifle, but in the context of the investigation, every detail can be important. So after completing the interrogation of Tasmia and Jasmia, the cops had a mixed impression. On the one hand, the girls seemed to be frank and admitted that lately their relationship with their mother had been, to put it mildly, strained. They even confessed that they sometimes thought about Nikki's death, but at the same time they insisted that they were not involved in the murder. On the other hand, it seemed that they were still hiding something. There were too many inconsistencies when comparing their testimonies obtained during separate interrogations. It's like putting together a puzzle, the pieces of which just won't fit together. And such a mismatch usually indicates a lie or concealment. Suspicions about the sisters only intensified after one incident. After the interrogation, the girls were sitting in the department room, hugging each other and seemingly crying. One of the employees, taking pity on them, approached and sympathetically asked if he could help them with something, do something for them. And then the unexpected happened. The sisters replied that they would like to watch TV. This moment just threw me off balance. Usually, children who have just lost their mother under such terrible circumstances are under such stress that TV is not even a question. But here, as if nothing had happened, life goes on as usual. Such a reaction seemed somehow unnatural, and it only heightened the doubts of law enforcement officers. In the end, the investigators came to the conclusion that it was necessary to talk with the entourage of the Whitehead family, their friends, neighbors, acquaintances, to ask them about how Nikki's relationship with her daughters was, what were the nuances of their family life. And the very first conversations opened their eyes to many things. It turned out that during the interrogation, the girls significantly smoothed out the severity of intrafamily conflicts, presenting everything as if there were problems, but not too serious ones. However, reality turned out to be much gloomier. To begin with, Nikki Whitehead herself was not born in the most favorable conditions. At the time of giving birth, her mother was serving a sentence in prison for distributing prohibited psychotropic substances, so the little one was taken care of by her grandmother Della Frazier. The woman felt very sorry for the girl, believed that she was already unlucky with the imprisoned mother, so from childhood she indulged all the whims of her granddaughter. When Nikki grew up, she repeatedly got involved with bad company and came to the attention of the police. Fortunately, somehow it did without serious consequences, but the fact remains the childhood and youth of the future victim were far from ideal. As for Della Frazier herself, after the detectives communicated with her, the impression was formed that this woman was excessively indulgent to the antics of her granddaughters. Perhaps she loved them in her own way, but she absolutely did not know how to keep them within the framework of discipline to resist their whims. So the girls got used to the fact that their grandmother allows and indulges everything. All this only emphasizes the unhealthy atmosphere in which the sisters grew up. As it turns out, at the age of 17, she gave birth to twins Tasmia and Jasmia. Almost nothing was known about the girls' father, only that shortly after their birth, he married another woman and moved to Canada, actually leaving the children to fend for themselves. According to eyewitnesses, despite her young age, Nikki sincerely rejoiced in motherhood and loved her daughters very much. But the trouble was that without a job and her own housing, the young mother was forced to give the little ones to her grandmother for upbringing, and she herself went to earn money. In fact, for several years she disappeared from the life of Tasmia and Jasmia, only rarely visiting them and sending money. But the immediate upbringing of the girls was carried out exclusively by the grandmother. Interestingly, despite such difficult circumstances, the sisters grew up to be very smart and diligent. According to teachers at school, they demonstrated remarkable success, were excellent students. In addition, they were engaged in art circles, participated in the Scout movement. And Della Frazier herself did not hide that she dreams of a brilliant future for her granddaughter's admission to prestigious universities, a decent career. It would seem that despite her daughter's early pregnancy and her irresponsibility, the woman managed to raise the girls properly. But as often happens behind the screen of well-being, a completely different reality was hidden. After talking with family acquaintances, the investigators realized that Della made the same mistake that she once did with Nikki. She brought up her granddaughters in an atmosphere of permissiveness and indulgence of whims. That is, if at school the girls behaved flawlessly, then at home they did not listen to their grandmother at all, did not recognize any rules or restrictions, and the woman could do nothing about it. But the real problems began when Robert Head appeared in Nikki's life. Although the man was much older than her, Nikki sincerely fell in love with him and soon moved in with him. And then she decided to take her daughters to live with her, filing a corresponding lawsuit in court. And the court sided with her when the girls were 7 years old. They moved to their mother and her new cohabitant. It would seem that finally the children were reunited with their own mother. They had a full-fledged home. But not everything was so cloudless. Robert, who worked as a long-distance trucker, was often away. And while he was absent, the girls seemed to break loose. Accustomed to permissiveness at their grandmother's, now they took Nikki's attempts to discipline them, to teach them at least some rules, with hostility. They openly rebelled against the routine established by their mother, although in fact it was quite reasonable lessons, limited time for walks, no gadgets before bed, and so on. But the girls were not going to put up with such oppression. According to neighbors, they tried in every possible way to circumvent their mother's prohibitions, and when she discovered disobedience, they quarreled with her through tantrums. It got to the point that Nikki began to take away phones from her daughters and forbid them to watch TV for their misdeeds. For girls who were used to free men at their grandmother's, this was a real drama, and they openly declared that they were not going to endure it. So slowly, day by day, the conflict between mother and daughters only escalated, and I understood that this discord could result in something worse than just quarrels and tantrums. It remained only to guess how far could the girls go to finally throw off the maternal shackles. Be that as it may, Nikki Whitehead did not give up. Even at 25, having become the mother of 2 already adult girls, she tried to build the right model of life for them. Yes, sometimes it was not easy for her, and the methods were sometimes too harsh, but the woman sincerely strove to give her daughters what she herself did not receive at their age. Having obtained custody of the children, Nikki immediately established clear rules. Right after school lessons, time for walks and entertainment was strictly limited. At night, no phones or other gadgets. Complete obedience and submission to the mother. For any offense, punishment, from confiscation of equipment to a ban on watching TV. For girls who had lived for years in the permissiveness of their grandmother's upbringing, this came as a real culture shock. At some point, Whitehead, Nikki's cohabitant, witnessed one of these quarrels, and then a completely different relationship developed between him and the girls. When the man was at home, they behaved restrainedly, even a little afraid of him. But as soon as Robert left for another trip on a long-distance truck, the sisters seemed to break loose. Conflicts with their mother literally happened every day. The woman desperately tried to cope with her rebellious daughters, but where they're in her hands, they openly laughed at her attempts to educate them, to set some kind of framework. This daily struggle drained Nikki morally and physically. She was torn between work and the constant need to rein in her disobedient girls. But even then, the thought occurred to me, was this pedagogy limited only to moral pressure and strict punishments? Perhaps in the heat of another conflict, it even came to assault. At least some family acquaintances hinted that sometimes quarrels moved into a dangerous phase. But what really happened there behind closed doors remained only to guess. It would seem that after so many conflicts and even police intervention, the situation should have somehow improved. But no, the quarrels between Nikki and her daughters only escalated. Once, after another call, my colleagues again came to the Whitehead house, and they found a familiar picture there. A frightened Nikki claimed that her daughters had attacked her with their fists as soon as the door closed behind the police. However, something didn't add up in this story. When the cops went upstairs to the sisters' room, they unanimously assured that it was their mother who attacked them, not the other way around. Only the girls' words sounded extremely unconvincing. Unlike Nikki, whose hands were covered with fresh scratches and bruises, there was not a single abrasion on Tasmia and Jasmia, and this led to certain reflections. In the end, the girls were taken to the police station that day, and later a trial was held over them. Having weighed all the circumstances, the servants of Themis came to the conclusion that it would be better for the daughters to return to the care of their grandmother, and they should be temporarily isolated from Nikki. It was thought that Della Frazier would be able to curb her unruly granddaughters. But no, even this indulgent woman could not handle the sisters who had completely gotten out of hand. They openly neglected her authority, did everything their own way, regardless of comments or requests. And with age, their behavior became more and more aggressive. The girls repeatedly came to the attention of the police due to minor offenses and clashes. At the same time, Della continued to desperately make excuses for them, despite the obviousness of the problem. The woman sincerely loved her granddaughters and justified them in everything. But child protection specialist understood. The elderly Mrs. Frazier no longer has the strength and ability to raise 2 teenagers with such deviations. Someone was needed who could take the girls under strict but fair control. And then all eyes again turned to Nikki Whitehead. Despite all the complexity of her relationship with her daughters, she remained their mother and great hopes were pinned on her. So at the beginning of 2010, when the sisters turned 16, another court session took place. Its verdict was as follows. The girls must return to their mother for 2 weeks, a kind of probationary period. There were rumors that during this time, the supervisory authorities repeatedly visited Nikki's house to make sure that everything was okay, and allegedly there were no changes. The girls remained just as disobedient and problematic. However, the guardianship specialists stubbornly turned a blind eye to this. They hoped that during these 2 weeks, the daughters would somehow come to an understanding with their mother, find a common language. But as it turned out, Tasmia and Jasmia themselves were extremely dissatisfied with this decision. They unanimously declared that they did not want to live under the same roof with Nikki, that they preferred to stay with their grandmother. It seemed that the prospect of spending at least a few weeks with their own mother caused them almost panic fear. And in my opinion, such a reaction was very indicative. But no matter how much the girls protested, no one listened to them. Everyone around stubbornly believed that these 2 weeks would be fateful for the Whitehead sisters, that it was during this time that they would finally come to an understanding with their mother, begin a new life as a normal, healthy family. How could they have imagined then what a horrific surprise awaited them in the near future? And so, after long vicissitudes and disputes, Tasmia and Jasmia still found themselves in the house of their mother Nikki Whitehead and her cohabitant Robert Head. The girls had just turned 16, and they were to spend 2 fateful weeks with their mother, a kind of probationary period that was to determine their future life. But fate decreed otherwise. Just 8 days after the start of this experiment, the irreparable happened. Nikki was found dead in her own home. The woman became a victim of a brutal murder, the circumstances of which shocked even seasoned police officers. Since all the evidence against the Whitehead sisters was indirect and circumstantial, the girls had to be released. They returned to their adored grandmother and at first glance began to live their usual life, the same as they led before their mother took them to live with her for the last time. According to relatives and neighbors, the girls became simply inseparable. If before they spent a lot of time together anyway, now they did not leave each other for a single step at all, as if they were afraid of getting lost or losing that invisible but strong sisterly bond. But the change in their behavior was most striking. If before the tragedy Tasmia and Jasmia were rather noisy and problematic girls, now they behaved quietly and calmly. Against the backdrop of accusations and gossip that rained down on them after their mother's death, the sisters seemed to be trying to become as inconspicuous as possible. At school, they almost stopped communicating with their peers. Immediately after classes, they hurried home. It seemed that the girls deliberately avoided any contact with the outside world, as if fearing unwanted attention to their persons. Meanwhile, the investigation into the murder of Nikki Whitehead was delayed for many months. The investigation carefully collected and checked all possible evidence, interviewed witnesses, put forward versions. But despite all efforts, the case did not budge for a long time. It seemed as if the criminal had not left a single trace, a single clue that could be grasped. And so, in May, the results of the examinations of the evidence collected at the crime scene finally came. For me, they did not become some kind of revelation, rather. They only confirmed those suspicions that arose immediately after acquaintance with the case. First, the bite marks on the hands of Tasmia and Jasmia perfectly matched the dental impressions of their murdered mother. Remember the episode when Tasmia suddenly began to bite her hand in the police car as if from severe stress? As it turned out, she did it not at all because of nervous tension. It was a desperate but extremely stupid way to mask the traces of her mother's teeth on her skin. Secondly, 2 boxes with their shoes were found in the sisters' room, on which traces of Nikki Whitehead's blood were clearly visible. And also that missing stack of towels from the bathroom, which I mentioned earlier. It was found stuffed into the washing machine, soaked in blood not only of the victim, but also of the twins themselves. These and other facts eloquently testified that it was not some mysterious malefactors who were involved in Nikki's death, but 2 people dear to her, Tasmia and Jasmia. Teenagers whom she so desperately tried to curb and put on the true path. Her own daughters. The only question that remained somewhat vague was the distribution of the sisters' roles in the commission of the crime. DNA examination was powerless to determine to which of the twins certain biological traces belonged. However, I had practically no doubt that the girls acted together and deliberately. The murder of the mother was not some tragic coincidence. It was planned and implemented as a well-organized and thought-out crime. Of course, the young age and the stunning cruelty of the deed could raise doubts. Are these delicate 16-year-old creatures really capable of such brutality? But unfortunately, my many years of practice show that anyone is capable of murder. And if a person has already decided to cross the line of law and morality, age and gender do not play the main role at all. Additional confirmation of this version was the video recording from the surveillance cameras of the school where the girls studied. It clearly shows how on the day of the murder, January 13, Tasmia and Jasmia enter the educational institution together at 10:17 in the morning. That is, in fact, they are late for half of the lessons. This raised a lot of questions. After all, if everything was as the sisters told at first, They should have left the house at 7:30 and, in the worst case, been late for some half an hour. Instead, we see the absence of girls in several classes in a row, and this leads to certain reflections. What were they doing all this time? Where were they, and what were they doing instead of sitting at their desks? Of course, at first the thought arose that Tasmia and Jasmia could simply skip classes like many other teenagers. But in the context of all the circumstances, this version looked unlikely. Unfortunately, it looked much more like the girls spent the morning hours implementing their horrific plan. Realizing the seriousness of the suspicions and the evidence collected, on May 21, our group went to the Whitehead Sister School. Right on the territory of the educational institution, in front of the stunned students and teachers, the detention of Tasmia and Jasmia took place. The girls were placed in an official car to be taken to the police station for further investigative actions. And here we witnessed a striking change in the behavior of the sisters. If earlier they pretended to be frightened and confused victims of circumstances, now they seemed to have dropped their masks. In the police car, the girls began to behave defiantly, even aggressively. They unanimously declared their non-involvement in the crime, accusing the cops of deliberately appointing them guilty in order to close the high-profile case as soon as possible. Even being in the police station, in the interrogation room, the sisters stubbornly refused to admit their guilt. It seemed that neither the iron evidence nor the psychological pressure was able to break through this wall of defiant silence. Tasmia and Jasmia sat side by side, tightly pursing their lips and looking at one point. In their eyes, one could read not only fright, but also some strange determination, like that of people who have already made a fateful decision. Looking back, I think it was at that moment that we all finally saw the true face of the Whitehead sisters. Not frightened children, not victims of circumstances, but two young individuals capable of a brutal and insidious crime. Cold-blooded, prudent murderers despite their 16 years. On July 12, after a thorough study of all the evidence and circumstances of the case, Tasmia and Jasmia were officially charged with the premeditated murder of their mother, Nikki. The girls were taken into custody before the trial. Without the right to bail, the charges against them were too serious. But the most interesting thing happened a little later. Realizing that the weight of evidence against them was irrefutable, the sisters suddenly decided to confess. And what they told during the next interrogation made even us, seasoned police officers, shudder. According to the girls, when their stepfather Robert was away, Nikki often drank. Moreover, she did it not like a normal person who wants to relax with a glass of wine, but abused it in a big way. Tasmia and Jasmia even suggested that sometimes their mother indulged in illegal substances, so inadequate was her behavior at such moments. With tears in their eyes, the sisters told how their drunken mother picked on them for any reason, provoked scandals out of the blue, and also that even when sober, Nikki was very cold and detached with them. The girls did not see any warmth or maternal love from her. Furthermore, on the eve of the tragedy, another drunken quarrel occurred. Nikki, pretty tipsy, began to yell at her daughters, calling them names. The scandal lasted almost until the morning, and only in the morning, tired, they all fell asleep. But they were not destined to rest. Just a few hours later, Nikki again burst into the girls' room and began to wake them up. They say it's time for school. At the same time, she carelessly poked them with a spoon and mumbled something about studying and responsibilities. And when the sisters went down to the kitchen to have breakfast, another conflict broke out over nothing. Then the sisters told quite terrible things about how they, unable to withstand the bullying, attacked their mother with a knife, how they dealt blow after blow until she fell dead, how they dragged the bloody body to the bathroom to somehow cover their tracks, how they washed the floor with towels but still could not remove all the blood. And after this horrific cleaning, the girls simply changed clothes, hid their shoes with traces of blood away, and, as if nothing had happened, went to school. When asked why they did not immediately tell the truth, the sisters did not give a clear answer. They only shrugged their shoulders and looked away. At the trial, Tasmia and Jasmia fully admitted their guilt. Without unnecessary emotions or attempts to justify themselves, they simply confirmed everything that they said during the interrogations. For the premeditated murder of their mother, the Whitehead sisters were sentenced to 30 years in prison. Their lawyer stated that such a sentence gives the girls hope for the future. They say, if they had not admitted guilt, the term could have been much tougher. Interestingly, even after being behind bars, the sisters managed to finish their schooling. Their grandmother Della Frazier was present even at the graduation. Despite all the horror of what her granddaughters did, the old woman continues to love and support them. An amazing woman, in my opinion. In 2017, Tasmia and Jasmia filed a petition for parole, but fortunately they were denied. If they do not receive more parole, they will be released only in 2044 when both will already be 47. I hope that during this time they will realize the full weight of their crime and repent. Although, to be honest, it's hard to believe in it. This is such a terrible and eerie story, friends. A story about how hatred and cruelty can poison even the closest people. About how important it is to notice the alarming signs in time and react to them. And that nothing in this world justifies such a brutal crime, not even teenage maximalism or difficult family relationships. I sincerely hope that I will never have to deal with such things again. But to be honest, something tells me that this is far from the last case when you have to look into the abyss of the human soul. Unfortunately, our work consists precisely of this. Take care of yourself and your loved ones, and may there be as few reasons as possible in your life to turn to cops like me. Thank you for your attention. This was Detective Brooks. You may like some of my next suggested videos. I love you, so likes, subscribes, and comments. See you next time.